The winter sun hung low over Antium when the child who would become Rome's most infamous emperor drew his first breath. This coastal town south of Rome, where wealthy families maintained villas overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, welcomed Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15th, OD 37, a date that astrologers would later claim had been marked by ominous signs, though such predictions always seemed clearer in hindsight than they ever appeared at the time. The infant entered a world ruled by his uncle Caligula, the young emperor whose reign had begun with promise but was already showing signs of the instability that would cut it short. Rome, in these years, moved to rhythms that shifted with imperial moods, the Senate and aristocracy learning to navigate currents that could change direction without warning. Into this uncertain atmosphere, the boy who would one day rule arrived carrying bloodlines that connected him to the very heart of Roman power. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from a family whose name meant bronze beard, a reference to an ancestor whose facial hair had supposedly been touched by the divine twins Castor and Pollux, turning it from black to red. The Domitii had served Rome for generations, producing consuls, generals, and administrators whose careers demonstrated the steady accumulation of honor that marked successful senatorial families. Gnaeus himself had achieved the consulship before his son's birth, his position reflecting the prominence his lineage commanded. Yet Gnaeus Domitius was not a man whom history remembers fondly. Ancient sources describe him as cruel and dishonest, his character marked by the vices that privilege sometimes nurtures in those who face no consequences for their behavior. When congratulated on his son's birth, he reportedly replied that any child born to himself and Agrippina could only be a disaster for Rome. Whether this story represents truth or later invention, shaped by knowledge of what the child would become, it captured something of the darkness that seemed to shadow the family from its earliest days. The mother who had given Lucius life possessed far greater significance for his future than his father ever would. Agrippina the Younger carried blood that flowed directly from Augustus himself, the founder of the imperial system that had transformed Rome from republic to monarchy. Her mother had been the elder Agrippina, granddaughter of Augustus and wife of the beloved general Germanicus, whose early death had left a wound in Roman hearts that never fully healed. Her brother was Caligula himself, the reigning emperor whose favor could elevate and whose displeasure could destroy. This Julio-Claudian heritage meant that the infant Lucius was not merely an aristocratic child, but a potential claimant to supreme power. The blood of Augustus ran in his veins through an unbroken maternal line, connecting him to the source of legitimacy that every subsequent emperor would invoke. In an age when dynasty meant everything and bloodlines determined destiny, the boy sleeping in his cradle at Antium represented possibilities that ambitious minds could not ignore. The child's father died when Lucius was barely 3 years old, his passing removing a presence that had contributed little beyond the biological fact of paternity. Gnaeus Domitius left behind debts, a tarnished reputation, and a son too young to remember him clearly in later years. The widow Agrippina found herself alone with an infant whose prospects depended entirely upon the political calculations of those who held power in Rome. Caligula's reign grew increasingly erratic as the months passed, his behavior alarming even those who had learned to accommodate imperial eccentricity. The emperor's relationship with his sisters, including Agrippina, became the subject of rumors that later writers would repeat with varying degrees of credulity. Whatever the truth of these whispers, Agrippina's position at court shifted from favor to danger, with the sudden reversals that characterized her brother's rule. Exile came in AD 39, when Caligula accused Agrippina of involvement in a conspiracy against his life. Whether she had actually plotted against her brother or merely fallen victim to his paranoia, the result was banishment to the Pontian Islands, a rocky outcropping in the Tyrrhenian Sea, where the empire sent those it wished to forget. The young Lucius remained behind in Rome, his care entrusted to relatives while his mother endured the hardships of island exile. The boy's childhood during these years of separation unfolded in the houses of an aunt named Domitia Lepida, where he received the basic education appropriate to his class, but apparently little of the luxury his birth might have suggested. Later sources claimed he was raised in near poverty, his inheritance consumed by Caligula's confiscations, his tutors, including a barber and a dancer, rather than the philosophers and rhetoricians who typically educated aristocratic youth. These stories may have been exaggerated, but they captured the precariousness that marked his early years. Everything changed in January of AD 41, when Praetorian guardsmen struck down Caligula in a palace corridor, their swords ending a reign that had lasted less than 4 years. The conspirators had planned to restore the Republic, but the guard had other ideas. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor. This stammering, scholarly man, whom his family had long dismissed as an embarrassment, now held supreme power, and his accession transformed the fortunes of everyone connected to the imperial house. Agrippina returned from exile, her banishment ended by an emperor who felt genuine affection for his brother Germanicus's children. She resumed her place among Rome's elite, her son restored to her care, with prospects that had seemed impossible just months before. The young Lucius now grew up in an atmosphere of renewed privilege, his education improving as his mother's position stabilized, and her ambitions for his future began to take clearer shape. The Rome through which the boy moved during these years presented contrasts that would have impressed any observer. The great public buildings that Augustus and his successors had constructed, forums and temples, theatres and baths, proclaimed the power and permanence of imperial rule. Yet behind the marble facades, the imperial family consumed itself in rivalries that had already claimed numerous victims and would claim many more before the dynasty exhausted itself. Claudius proved a more capable ruler than his relatives had expected, his scholarly nature concealing administrative abilities that served the empire well. He expanded Roman territory through the conquest of Britain, reformed the bureaucracy by employing freedmen whose loyalty ran directly to himself, and generally provided the stable governance that Caligula's erratic reign had denied. His weakness lay in his choice of wives, whose influence over the aging emperor shaped the succession in ways he never fully controlled. Messalina, Claudius's third wife, bore him 2 children, a daughter named Octavia and a son named Britannicus, who represented the emperor's direct heir. Her position seemed unassailable until her own recklessness destroyed her. A scandal involving a mock marriage to a senator provoking Claudius into ordering her execution in AD 48. The emperor, who had shown mercy to many enemies, proved capable of ruthlessness when his honor demanded it, and Messalina died before she could mount any defense of her conduct. Agrippina moved into the vacuum that Messalina's death created, her campaign for Claudius's affection, demonstrating the political skills she had developed during years of survival in the most dangerous environment Rome could offer. The emperor was her uncle, which should have prevented marriage under Roman law, but the Senate proved willing to adjust legal definitions when the emperor's wishes required accommodation. In AD 49, Claudius married Agrippina, elevating her to the position of Augusta and bringing her son into the immediate orbit of imperial power. The adoption that followed represented the culmination of Agrippina's strategy. Claudius already had a biological son in Britannicus, but the emperor agreed to adopt Agrippina's boy as well, creating a situation where two potential heirs would compete for succession. The child who had been born, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, now became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, his new name proclaiming his incorporation into the Julio-Claudian line, and his claim to the inheritance that adoption had conveyed. Seneca arrived to take charge of Nero's education, the philosopher's presence reflecting Agrippina's determination that her son would be prepared for the responsibilities she intended him to assume. This brilliant Stoic had spent years in exile on Corsica, his banishment the result of Messalina's hostility, but Agrippina secured his recall and placed him beside the boy whose mind he would shape. The lessons that followed emphasized rhetoric, philosophy, and the arts of governance, training designed to produce an emperor who could hold his own in any company. The household that now surrounded young Nero combined luxury with purpose, every element calculated to advance his prospects. Tutors drilled him in Greek and Latin literature, exposing him to Homer and Virgil, to the philosophers whose ideas Seneca interpreted and applied. The boy showed aptitude for these studies, and particular enthusiasm for music and poetry, interests that his teachers encouraged without yet realizing how consuming they would become. Britannicus, the younger boy, whose biological claim might have seemed stronger than his adopted brothers, found himself increasingly marginalized as Agrippina's influence over Claudius deepened. The emperor seemed content to favor his new wife's son over his own. The reasons for this preference unclear, but its effects unmistakable. Nero appeared at public ceremonies in the toga of manhood, while Britannicus still wore the clothes of childhood, the visual distinction announcing to all Rome which boy held the inside track to succession. By the end of AD 49, the transformation was complete. The child who had spent his earliest years in obscurity and exile now stood as the presumptive heir to the greatest empire the world had known. Agrippina had achieved what few could have imagined possible, positioning her son to inherit power that had seemed reserved for others. The stage was set for the final steps that would carry Nero from adopted prince to ruling emperor, though the path ahead still held dangers that even Agrippina's formidable skills could not entirely control. The boy who walked through Rome's marble corridors in these years carried within him seeds that would flower in ways no one could predict. The artistic temperament that his tutors had noted, the sensitivity that distinguished him from the martial traditions of Roman aristocracy, the hunger for approval that would shape so many of his later decisions. All these qualities were forming in the adolescent who would soon be called upon to rule. Whether Rome had gained a philosopher king or something far more complicated, only time would reveal. The years that followed Nero's adoption unfolded in an atmosphere of careful preparation, every element of his education designed to produce a ruler capable of governing the vast territories Rome commanded. Seneca proved a demanding but inspiring teacher, his Stoic philosophy providing frameworks for understanding duty, self-control, and the responsibilities that power imposed upon those who wielded it. The lessons took place in quiet rooms, where scrolls lined the walls and the sounds of the city seemed distant, creating spaces for contemplation that the busy imperial court rarely offered. Greek literature captivated the young prince with particular intensity. Homer's epics transported him to worlds of heroes and gods, while the tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored the consequences of fate and human choice in ways that resonated with a boy whose own destiny seemed both magnificent and uncertain. Nero absorbed these works not merely as academic exercises, but as living texts whose beauty moved him to responses that surprised his tutors with their emotional depth. Music became an increasingly important part of his studies. The lyre, an instrument whose mastery he pursued with dedication that exceeded what his position required. Roman aristocrats traditionally appreciated music without performing it themselves. That was work for slaves and freedmen, entertainment to be enjoyed rather than created. Yet Nero showed no interest in maintaining such distinctions, his fingers seeking the strings with a passion that suggested art might matter more to him than the political skills his mother intended him to develop. Poetry flowed from his pen in verses that he shared eagerly with those around him, seeking the approval that would become an enduring hunger throughout his life. Whether these early compositions showed genuine talent or merely the competence that good teaching could produce in any willing student, the encouragement he received convinced him that artistic achievement represented a worthy pursuit for one destined to rule. The seeds of later obsession were planted in these adolescent years, watered by praise that may have been more politic than sincere. Afranius Burrus joined Seneca in guiding the young prince, this gruff military officer providing a counterbalance to the philosopher's intellectual emphasis. Burrus commanded the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose loyalty determined which emperors survived and which fell to palace conspiracies. His presence in Nero's education signaled that the boy must understand military realities as well as philosophical principles, the sword as well as the scroll. Together, Seneca and Burrus formed a partnership that would shape Nero's early reign as profoundly as it shaped his youth. The marriage to Octavia in AD 53 represented political calculation rather than romantic attachment. This daughter of Claudius was technically Nero's stepsister following his adoption, a relationship that required legal maneuvering to permit the union. She was quiet, dutiful, and apparently quite unlike the passionate temperament that Nero was already displaying. The wedding ceremonies followed ancient forms, the rituals binding two young people whose compatibility mattered far less than the dynastic connections their union reinforced. Octavia brought legitimacy that adoption alone could not fully provide. As Claudius's biological daughter, she represented an unbroken connection to the reigning emperor that strengthened Nero's position against any who might champion Britannicus as the rightful heir. Agrippina had orchestrated the match with her usual strategic precision, adding another strand to the web of relationships that secured her son's path to power. That the marriage would prove emotionally barren concerned her not at all. Affection was a luxury that imperial marriages rarely enjoyed. Britannicus himself continued to fade into the background as Nero's prominence grew. The younger boy attended the same functions, lived in the same palace, studied with some of the same tutors, yet found himself increasingly invisible in a court that had learned to orient itself toward the rising sun rather than the setting one. Whether he resented his displacement or accepted it with the resignation that his situation required, the sources do not clearly reveal. He remained a potential threat simply by existing, his claim to the throne a card that ambitious men might someday play. Claudius seemed increasingly distant from the machinations unfolding around him, the elderly emperor absorbed in his scholarly projects, while Agrippina managed the practical business of securing the succession. His histories of the Etruscans and Carthaginians occupied hours that might otherwise have been spent attending to the subtle shifts in power that his wife was engineering. Whether this detachment reflected genuine obliviousness or a weary acceptance that events had moved beyond his control, the effect was the same. Agrippina's influence continued to grow while the emperor retreated into his books. The public role that Nero assumed during these years allowed Rome to observe the prince who would soon rule them. He appeared at games and festivals, his youth and evident intelligence creating favorable impressions among citizens who remembered too well the terrors of Caligula's reign. He delivered speeches that Seneca had helped him craft, his rhetoric polished and his manner confident, without the arrogance that Romans found offensive in their rulers. The city began to hope that this young man might provide the stable governance they craved. Nero received the toga virilis in AD 51, the ceremony marking his transition from boyhood to manhood occurring earlier than custom prescribed. Another indication of Agrippina's determination to advance her son's position by every available means. He was granted proconsular authority outside Rome and tribunician power within it, honors that placed him unmistakably above Britannicus in the hierarchy of succession. The Senate voted these privileges with the enthusiasm that imperial wishes always commanded, their decrees confirming what everyone already understood. The summer of AD 54 brought signs that Claudius's long reign was approaching its end. The emperor had never been robust, his physical ailments the subject of comment since his youth, but now his health seemed to deteriorate more rapidly than before. Whether age alone accounted for his decline or other factors contributed, those who watched him closely began to calculate what his death would mean for their own positions. Agrippina's role in what followed has been debated since antiquity, the sources presenting accounts that vary in detail, but agree in their essential conclusion. Claudius dined on mushrooms, a delicacy he particularly enjoyed, and fell ill shortly afterward. The symptoms he displayed suggested poisoning, and later writers would identify the notorious Locusta as the preparer of the fatal dish. Her expertise in toxins supposedly enlisted by an empress determined to control the timing of the succession. Whether Agrippina actually murdered her husband or merely took advantage of a natural death that occurred at a convenient moment, the result was the same. Claudius died on October 13th, AD 54. His passing carefully managed to ensure that Nero's accession proceeded smoothly. The announcement was delayed until the astrologers declared the moment propitious, the timing suggesting that those who controlled the situation felt no urgency that might have accompanied a genuinely unexpected death. Nero emerged from the palace to meet the Praetorian Guard, his youth striking observers who remembered emperors as older men worn by the burdens of power. He was 16 years old, his face still soft with adolescence, his manner reflecting the education he had received rather than the experience he had yet to acquire. Burrus presented him to the soldiers whose loyalty would determine whether he survived his first day as emperor, their acclamation echoing through the camp as they hailed their new ruler. The Senate confirmed what the Guard had proclaimed, their votes ratifying a succession that Agrippina had spent years preparing. Nero addressed the assembled fathers in words that Seneca had written, promising to rule according to the principles that Augustus had established, to respect the Senate's dignity, and to avoid the errors that had marked less successful reigns. The speech was everything Rome could have wished, moderate, respectful, and promising a future very different from the chaos many had feared. The donative distributed to the soldiers secured their loyalty with gold as effectively as words had engaged their emotions. Each guardsman received a sum that represented months of ordinary pay, the generosity establishing patterns of expectation that every subsequent emperor would struggle to meet or exceed. Nero understood, or his advisors understood for him, that the men who had made him emperor could unmake him just as easily if their material interests were not satisfied. Claudius received divine honors with appropriate ceremony, the Senate voting him a place among the gods, despite whatever private reservations individual members might have harbored about his merits. The funeral procession wound through streets lined with citizens whose grief was genuine or performed according to the occasion's requirements. Nero delivered the eulogy, praising the man who had adopted him and given him the path to power, though those who listened carefully might have noted that the praise was conventional rather than heartfelt. The empire that the young emperor inherited stretched from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Millions of people speaking dozens of languages now looked to this teenager for the governance that maintained peace, administered justice, and defended borders against enemies who never stopped probing for weakness. The weight of responsibility would have crushed many men of greater experience. Yet Nero assumed it with a confidence that his advisors had carefully cultivated. Seneca and Burrus stood ready to guide him through the challenges ahead, their partnership providing the practical wisdom that youth alone could not supply. Agrippina expected to continue the influence she had exercised during Claudius's final years, her position as the new emperor's mother seemingly guaranteeing her a central role in his reign. The court settled into new configurations as everyone calculated what the change in rulers meant for their own prospects. The boy who had once faced an uncertain future now held power that only death could remove. The education that Seneca had provided, the connections that Agrippina had forged, the legitimacy that adoption and marriage had conferred, all these elements had combined to place Nero on a throne he had been prepared to occupy since childhood. What he would make of this inheritance, whether he would fulfill the promise his early reign suggested or descend into the excesses that history would remember, remained to be discovered in the years ahead. Rome held its breath, hoping for the best while fearing the worst. The city had learned through bitter experience that young emperors could disappoint the expectations placed upon them, that promise often faded into tyranny as power revealed the true character of those who wielded it. Yet for this moment, at least, optimism seemed justified. The new emperor had said all the right things, surrounded himself with capable advisors, and shown none of the alarming signs that had marked Caligula's early reign. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps this boy would become the ruler Rome deserved. The early years of Nero's reign would later be remembered as a golden age, a period when wise counsel restrained youthful impulses, and the empire enjoyed governance that even critical historians acknowledged as remarkably competent. Seneca and Burrus formed an effective partnership, the philosopher handling civil administration, while the soldier managed military affairs, their collaboration creating stability that allowed the young emperor to grow into his role without the crises that might have overwhelmed him. Nero himself seemed content to follow his advisor's guidance during these initial months, his speeches reflecting Seneca's careful phrasing, his decisions bearing the marks of experienced counsel. The Senate found itself treated with a respect it had not enjoyed since Augustus's time, its debates actually influencing policy rather than merely ratifying predetermined outcomes. Senators who had learned to cringe before Caligula and maneuver around Claudius now discovered that their opinions genuinely mattered, at least on matters where the emperor's personal interests were not engaged. Tax collection became more equitable, as abuses that had enriched corrupt officials were curtailed. Provincial governors faced accountability for their conduct. The emperor's attention to administrative detail suggesting that Seneca's lessons in governance had taken root. Trade flourished as merchants found their contracts enforced and their goods protected, the economic confidence that stable rule provided benefiting communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet shadows gathered even during this seemingly bright beginning. Britannicus remained a living reminder that Nero's claim to the throne rested on adoption rather than blood. the younger boy's existence a potential rallying point for anyone who might wish to challenge the new regime. The tension between the two youths had been apparent since childhood, their rivalry sharpened by the stakes that now attended their relationship. The dinner party in February of AD 55 brought this rivalry to its permanent end. Britannicus collapsed during the meal, his body convulsing before the assembled guests, his life ending within moments, while Nero watched with a composure that struck observers as either admirable self-control or chilling indifference. The official explanation attributed his death to epilepsy, a condition he had supposedly suffered since childhood, but whispers of poison spread through Rome, with the speed that such rumors always traveled. Whether Nero ordered his stepbrother's death or merely benefited from a convenient natural occurrence, the result eliminated the most obvious alternative to his rule. Britannicus received burial without the honors that his imperial blood might have warranted, his memory quickly fading as the court adjusted to a reality where no legitimate rival remained. Agrippina, who had reportedly been cultivating the younger boy as leverage against her son's growing independence, found her position suddenly weakened by the loss of her most valuable card. The relationship between Nero and his mother had begun deteriorating almost from the moment of his accession. Agrippina had expected to rule through her son as she had ruled through Claudius, her influence continuing undiminished despite the change in emperors. She attended meetings, received ambassadors, and generally conducted herself as a co-regent whose authority matched or exceeded that of the teenage emperor she had created. Nero's advisors worked systematically to reduce this maternal dominance, recognizing that Agrippina's continued power threatened their own positions and complicated the governance they were trying to establish. Seneca and Burrus encouraged the young emperor to assert his independence, supporting decisions that contradicted his mother's wishes and gradually excluding her from the councils where policy was actually made. The struggle that followed would reshape the imperial court and ultimately end in tragedy. A freedwoman named Acte became the instrument of Nero's first significant rebellion against maternal control. This former slave, whose beauty and gentle disposition attracted the young emperor's attention, represented everything Agrippina opposed. A relationship based on personal feeling rather than political calculation. An attachment that served no dynastic purpose and reflected Nero's own desires rather than his mother's plans. The affair that developed between them was Nero's declaration of emotional independence. Agrippina's fury at discovering this relationship revealed how completely she had lost perspective on her situation. She raged against Acte with an intensity that only strengthened Nero's attachment, her opposition transforming a youthful infatuation into a symbolic battleground where the emperor's autonomy would be decided. Seneca and Burrus, whatever their private opinions of the liaison, recognized its usefulness in breaking Agrippina's hold and quietly facilitated arrangements that allowed the affair to continue. The empress mother found herself progressively marginalized as the months passed. Her residence was moved from the palace to a separate house, her guard of honor reduced, her access to her son increasingly restricted. Visitors who had once sought her favor now avoided her company, calculating that association with a falling star could only damage their own prospects. The woman who had orchestrated Nero's rise to power watched helplessly as the power she had created slipped beyond her grasp. Poppaea Sabina entered Nero's life during these years of transformation, her beauty and intelligence captivating an emperor whose marriage to Octavia had never engaged his emotions. This wife of the nobleman Otho possessed qualities that the dutiful but colorless Octavia lacked: wit, passion, ambition, and a willingness to deploy her considerable charms in pursuit of objectives that extended far beyond mere romantic attachment. She would become the great love of Nero's life and the catalyst for some of his most controversial decisions. The relationship with Poppaea developed gradually, complicated by her existing marriage and by the political implications that any change in Nero's domestic arrangements would carry. Otho found himself dispatched to govern Lusitania, a distant province where he could pursue his career without the inconvenience of a wife who had attracted the emperor's attention. The arrangement suited everyone except perhaps Octavia, whose position as empress became increasingly nominal as her husband's affections turned elsewhere. Agrippina's final years unfolded against this backdrop of shifting relationships and diminishing influence. She reportedly attempted various strategies to reclaim her position, threatening to champion other claimants to the throne, reminding Nero of the crimes she had committed to secure his succession, even allegedly offering herself to her son in a desperate gamble to restore intimacy through whatever means might prove effective. These stories, preserved by hostile sources, may represent exaggeration or invention, but they captured the desperation of a woman watching her life's work crumble. The decision to eliminate Agrippina appears to have crystallized in AD 59, when Nero concluded that his mother's continued existence posed threats that tolerance could no longer manage. The method chosen reflected both the difficulty of the task and the desire to avoid the appearance of matricide. A collapsing boat designed to drown her during a voyage across the Bay of Naples, the accident meant to seem a tragic mishap rather than deliberate murder. The scheme failed when Agrippina survived the boat's collapse, swimming to shore with the determination that had characterized her entire life. Her response to this obvious assassination attempt was to pretend she believed it had been an accident, sending messengers to inform her son that she had escaped unharmed from a maritime disaster. This pretense forced Nero to choose between allowing his mother to live with full knowledge of what he had attempted or completing the deed through more direct means. Soldiers arrived at Agrippina's villa that night, their mission leaving no room for the ambiguity that the failed boat plot had created. She reportedly faced her killers with the courage that her ancestry demanded, offering her womb to their swords and declaring that they should strike the body that had borne such a son. Whether these final words were actually spoken or later invented to provide dramatic closure, they captured something essential about a woman whose entire existence had been defined by the relationship now ending in violence. The aftermath required careful management if Nero hoped to escape the stigma of matricide. Official accounts portrayed Agrippina as a conspirator whose plot against the emperor had been discovered just in time. Her death the necessary consequence of treason rather than the murder of a mother by her son. The Senate, recognizing what was expected of them, voted thanks for the emperor's deliverance and declared the date of Agrippina's death a holiday. Few believed the official story, but fewer still were prepared to challenge it openly. Nero himself reportedly suffered torments of guilt that pursued him long after his mother's death. He claimed to see her ghost, to hear her voice in his dreams, to feel her presence in moments of solitude when the distractions of power fell away. Whether genuine remorse or calculated performance designed to elicit sympathy, these displays suggested that the break with Agrippina had cost him something that power could not replace. The boy who had been raised to rule found himself haunted by the price his rule had demanded. The court that emerged from these upheavals bore little resemblance to the one that had celebrated Nero's accession 5 years earlier. Agrippina was gone, her influence replaced by that of advisors who served the emperor's interests rather than their own dynastic ambitions. Poppeia's position strengthened as obstacles to her relationship with Nero were progressively removed. The Senate continued to enjoy the respect that the early reign had established. though perceptive observers might have noticed that this respect depended entirely on Nero's continued willingness to maintain appearances that he found increasingly tedious. The golden age of Nero's reign was not yet over. Seneca and Burrus still provided guidance. The administration still functioned effectively, and the empire still enjoyed the peace that competent governance sustained. But the events of AD 59 had revealed capacities for violence that the moderate image of the early years had concealed. The emperor who had promised to rule like Augustus had now killed his mother, a crime that not even the worst of his predecessors had committed. Whatever came next, Rome could no longer pretend that its young ruler was simply a mild prince guided by philosophical advisors. The years following Agrippina's death marked Nero's emergence as the ruler he had always wished to become. An artist first, an emperor second, a man whose deepest satisfactions came not from the exercise of power, but from the applause of audiences who appreciated his creative gifts. The restraints that mother and advisors had imposed gradually fell away, revealing a personality that Rome had never seen occupy the throne and would struggle to understand throughout his remaining years. Music consumed his attention with an intensity that alarmed those who believed emperors should concern themselves with armies and administration rather than lyres and vocal training. Nero practiced for hours each day, his voice the instrument he was determined to perfect, his technique the subject of endless refinement under teachers whose praise he valued more than the Senate's approval. He subjected himself to the regimens that professional performers followed: dietary restrictions, exercises to strengthen the diaphragm, periods of silence to rest the vocal cords that carried his artistic ambitions. The contradiction between imperial dignity and artistic performance troubled Romans, whose traditions reserved such activities for slaves, freedmen, and the lower classes. An emperor might appreciate music, might patronize musicians, might even compose verses for private circulation among admiring friends. But to stand before audiences and seek their applause, to submit himself to the judgment of crowds whose approval or disapproval would be publicly expressed, this violated every principle that Roman aristocracy held sacred about the proper behavior of those who commanded rather than entertained. Nero seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why his passion for performance should occasion such concern. The Greek culture he had absorbed since childhood celebrated artistic achievement regardless of the performer's social status, its values placing creative excellence above the distinctions that Roman tradition considered fundamental. He saw himself as heir to traditions stretching back to Apollo himself, the god whose lyre had produced music that moved the cosmos. What greater aspiration could any ruler pursue than mastery of arts that connected humanity to the divine? Burrus died in AD 62, his passing removing one of the pillars that had supported Nero's early moderation. The gruff soldier who had commanded the Praetorian Guard since before Nero's accession had provided a counterbalance to Seneca's philosophical influence, his practical wisdom tempering decisions that purely intellectual considerations might have distorted. Some whispered that his death was not natural, that poison had silenced a voice grown too independent for the emperor's comfort. Though the evidence for such accusations remained circumstantial, his replacement transformed the character of Nero's inner circle. Aphonius Tigellinus, the new Praetorian prefect, brought qualities very different from those Burrus had offered: ambition unconstrained by scruple, a talent for identifying and exploiting the emperor's weaknesses, and a willingness to facilitate whatever desires Nero expressed without the cautionary counsel that Burrus had provided. Where Burrus had served the empire through Nero, Tigellinus served Nero regardless of consequences for the empire. Seneca recognized that his own position had become untenable in this transformed court. The philosopher who had guided Nero since childhood now found his advice ignored, his presence tolerated rather than welcomed, his influence supplanted by men whose values bore no resemblance to the stoic principles he had tried to instill. He requested permission to retire, offering to return the vast wealth that imperial favor had bestowed upon him, seeking only the quiet of his estates where he could spend his remaining years in contemplation. Nero refused the resignation with expressions of affection that may have been genuine despite their ultimate emptiness. He could not spare his beloved teacher, could not accept wealth that he had given freely, could not permit the withdrawal that Seneca's continued health and vigor made unnecessary. The refusal bound Seneca to a court where his presence had become merely decorative, his wisdom unwanted, his position a reminder of virtues that the emperor no longer wished to cultivate. The marriage to Poppaea finally became possible once the obstacles that had delayed it were removed. Octavia, the empress whose bloodline had reinforced Nero's claim to legitimacy, found herself divorced on grounds of barrenness, an accusation that conveniently ignored the obvious explanation that Nero had shown no interest in producing children with a wife he had never loved. She was sent from Rome to Campania, her fate uncertain, but her position as empress definitively ended. Poppaea's triumph proved brief before she demanded more. Octavia's continued existence, even in distant exile, represented a potential rallying point for those who might oppose the new empress or the emperor who had elevated her. Popular sentiment in Rome had favored Octavia, whose quiet dignity during years of neglect had earned sympathy that her replacement's ambitious reputation could not match. Protests erupted when news of the divorce spread, crowds demonstrating support for the discarded wife with an intensity that alarmed the palace. The response to these demonstrations revealed how far Nero had traveled from the moderate ruler of his early years. Octavia was accused of adultery, the charge supported by testimony extracted through torture from her attendants, and exiled to the island of Pandateria, where Augustus had once sent his own daughter for similar offences. Days later, soldiers arrived with orders that ended any possibility of her return. She was barely 20 years old when she died, her veins opened in a death staged to appear as suicide, her head sent to Poppaea as proof that no rival remained. The wedding that followed united Nero with the woman who had shaped so many of his recent decisions. Poppaea became empress with ceremonies appropriate to her new status, her beauty and sophistication, gracing a court that she would dominate until fate intervened. She bore Nero a daughter in AD 63. The infant Claudia received with celebrations that proclaimed the dynasty's continuation, though the child survived only 4 months before death, robbed her parents of the heir they had created together. Nero's artistic ambitions found public expression through the Neronia, a festival he established in AD 60 on the Greek model, with competitions in music, poetry, athletics, and chariot racing. The emperor did not yet perform publicly himself. That boundary remained unbroken during these years. But the festival proclaimed his values to a Rome that was learning to accommodate imperial eccentricity. Greek culture received celebration that traditionalists found excessive, its influence reshaping Roman entertainment in ways that would long outlast Nero's reign. Private performances before carefully selected audiences allowed Nero to test his abilities without the risks that public appearance would have entailed. Senators and equestrians found themselves summoned to recitals, where the emperor displayed his voice and his verses, their applause expected regardless of their private opinions about what they witnessed. These command performances created awkward situations for those whose aesthetic judgment conflicted with their instinct for survival. Praising badly was dangerous, but so was praising insufficiently. The gymnasium that Nero constructed near the baths he had built offered Rome facilities for the athletic training that Greeks considered essential to civilized life. Romans had traditionally viewed such establishments with suspicion, associating them with the nudity and homosexuality that they believed characterized Greek culture at its most decadent. Nero's gymnasium challenged these prejudices directly, its presence in the heart of Rome, announcing that Greek values would receive imperial patronage, regardless of conservative objections. Construction projects multiplied as Nero's aesthetic vision found expression in architecture as well as performance. The Domus Transitoria, a palace complex connecting imperial properties on the Palatine and Esquiline hills, demonstrated ambitions that would reach fuller expression in later building projects. Gardens and galleries, fountains and frescoed chambers, these spaces reflected an emperor who understood himself as an artist whose medium included the built environment as well as music and poetry. The administration of the empire continued functioning effectively, despite the emperor's distractions, the bureaucratic machinery that Claudius had developed proving capable of operating with minimal imperial attention. Seneca's influence, though diminished, had not entirely disappeared, and competent officials throughout the provinces maintained the governance that kept taxes flowing, disputes resolved, and borders defended. The gap between Nero's artistic preoccupations and administrative responsibilities had not yet widened to the point where the empire suffered visible consequences. Provincial affairs occasionally demanded the attention that Nero preferred to devote elsewhere. Armenia required military intervention when Parthian interference threatened Roman interests in a region that had been contested between the two empires for generations. Corbulo, the general entrusted with eastern operations, conducted campaigns that restored Roman prestige without requiring the emperor's personal participation. The settlement eventually reached would provide stability along the Euphrates frontier for decades to come. Britain continued absorbing the resources that its conquest and pacification demanded. The rebellion led by Boudicca in AD 60 had demonstrated how fragile Roman control remained in territories recently brought under imperial authority. The suppression of this uprising, though ultimately successful, revealed vulnerabilities that required ongoing military commitment. Nero showed little personal interest in these distant operations, content to leave provincial governance to subordinates, while he pursued the artistic achievements that mattered more to him than territorial administration. Poppeia's influence over her husband grew as other advisors faded from significance. She encouraged his artistic ambitions, supported his increasingly public performances, and generally reinforced the aspects of his personality that traditional Romans found most troubling. Whether she genuinely shared his aesthetic values or simply recognized that encouraging them strengthened her own position, the effect was the same. Nero felt validated in pursuits that his earlier advisors had tried to moderate or redirect. The Rome that approached the summer of AD 64 presented contrasts that reflected its emperor's divided nature. The city's administration functioned, its commerce flourished, and its citizens enjoyed spectacles and entertainments that Nero's generosity provided. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, tensions accumulated that the emperor's artistic preoccupations prevented him from addressing. The gap between the ruler Rome needed and the artist Nero wished to become widened with each passing season, creating stresses that the existing order could not indefinitely sustain. The disaster that would transform both the city and its emperor's reputation was approaching, though no one in those early summer days could have predicted the scale of what was to come. Fire had always threatened Rome, its crowded neighborhoods and wooden construction creating conditions that made conflagrations inevitable. The blaze that began near the Circus Maximus on the night of July 18th, AD 64, would prove different from all that had preceded it. A catastrophe so complete that it would divide Nero's reign into before and after, reshaping everything that followed in its terrible light. The flames that erupted among the shops clustered near the circus. Maximus spread with a speed that overwhelmed every attempt at containment. Summer heat had dried the wooden tenements that housed Rome's poorer citizens, their cramped structures providing fuel that fed the fire's hunger as it swept through district after district. The narrow streets that characterized so much of the city channeled winds that carried embers to new locations faster than firefighting crews could respond. Nero was at Antium, the coastal town of his birth, when messengers brought news of the conflagration consuming his capital. He returned immediately, the journey covering the 35 miles with urgency that reflected the disaster's magnitude. What he found upon arrival exceeded anything Rome had experienced since the Gallic sack nearly 5 centuries earlier. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, landmarks that had stood for generations collapsed into rubble, and hundreds of thousands of citizens wandering the streets with nothing beyond what they had managed to carry from their burning homes. The response that Nero organized demonstrated administrative capabilities that his artistic preoccupations had sometimes obscured. He opened the imperial gardens to refugees, providing shelter for families who had lost everything in the flames. The Campus Martius, with its open spaces and monumental buildings, became a staging area for relief efforts that the emperor personally supervised. Grain supplies were brought in from Ostia at reduced prices, the imperial treasury absorbing costs that would otherwise have created famine on top of destruction. The fire burned for 6 days before firefighters managed to create fire breaks that halted its advance, only to reignite and continue for 3 more days before finally exhausting itself. When the smoke cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had suffered damage, with 3 completely destroyed and 7 more severely affected. Temples that had witnessed centuries of worship lay in ruins, their sacred contents consumed by flames that respected no antiquity. The Domus Transitoria, Nero's own palace complex, had burned along with everything else, the emperor himself among those who had lost their homes. The legend that Nero played his lyre while Rome burned emerged almost immediately, though the historical basis for this accusation remains uncertain. Some sources place him on a private stage, singing verses about the destruction of Troy, while his own capital suffered a similar fate. Others suggest he participated actively in firefighting efforts, his presence in the streets visible to citizens who might have expected their emperor to remain safely distant from danger. The truth likely lies somewhere between heroic involvement and callous indifference, but the image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned would prove more durable than any competing narrative. Suspicions that the fire had been deliberately set found ready audiences among a population seeking explanations for catastrophe. The conflagration had behaved strangely, witnesses reported, burning with unusual intensity, reigniting in areas already extinguished, spreading in patterns that suggested deliberate extension rather than natural progression. Someone must have started it, and the search for culprits began even before the flames had fully died. Nero himself faced accusations that he had ordered the fire to clear land for building projects that existing structures prevented. The Domus Aurea, the magnificent palace complex he would soon construct, would occupy territory that the fire had conveniently cleared. His known enthusiasm for architecture, combined with complaints about Rome's narrow streets and overcrowded neighborhoods, made it easy to imagine him sacrificing the old city to create space for his artistic vision. Whether these accusations contained any truth, or simply reflected the human need to assign blame for inexplicable disaster. They damaged Nero's reputation in ways that no denial could repair. The emperor sought to deflect these accusations by identifying alternative culprits whose punishment might satisfy popular anger. Christians provided a convenient target. This small religious community had attracted suspicion through practices that their neighbors found strange, and through beliefs that set them apart from the traditions Romans shared. Their worship of a crucified criminal, their refusal to participate in public ceremonies, their talk of the world's imminent destruction by fire. All these characteristics made them plausible scapegoats for a population seeking someone to blame. The persecution that followed marked Christianity's first encounter with systematic imperial violence, directed specifically against believers as a group. Previous persecutions had been local affairs, the result of individual governors, hostility, or popular riots that authorities chose not to suppress. Nero's persecution was different, an official campaign conducted in the capital itself, using the full resources of imperial power to identify, arrest, and execute members of a community whose only crime was their faith. The methods of execution reflected a cruelty that shocked even observers who shared Nero's conviction that Christians deserved punishment. Believers were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified in public spaces or coated with pitch, and set alight to serve as torches, illuminating the imperial gardens after darkness fell. These spectacles, intended to demonstrate that justice had been served and the fire's perpetrators punished, instead created sympathy for victims whose suffering seemed disproportionate to any offense they might have committed. Christian tradition would remember this persecution as foundational martyrdom, the blood of believers watering seeds that would eventually flower into the faith's triumph over the empire that had tried to destroy it. Peter and Paul, the apostles whose missions had brought Christianity to Rome, reportedly died during these years. Peter crucified upside down at his own request, Paul beheaded as the Roman citizen he claimed to be. Whether their deaths occurred during Nero's persecution or at other times remains debated, but their association with his reign reinforced the image of Nero as Christianity's first great enemy. The rebuilding of Rome proceeded according to plans that transformed catastrophe into opportunity. Wider streets replaced the narrow lanes that had channeled the fire's spread, their broader dimensions both reducing future fire risk and creating sightlines that enhanced the city's monumental character. Building codes required fireproof materials for new construction, the brick and stone that would replace wooden tenements, creating a more durable urban fabric. Porticos provided covered walkways that protected pedestrians from sun and rain, while creating fire breaks between structures. The Domus Aurea rose from the ashes as the centerpiece of Nero's rebuilt Rome, a palace complex whose scale and magnificence exceeded anything the city had previously witnessed. The vestibule alone was large enough to contain a colossal statue of the emperor, its dimensions so vast that the structure would later give its name to the Colosseum built nearby. Gardens, lakes, and pavilions spread across territory that had previously housed thousands of ordinary citizens, the transformation proclaiming that imperial ambition had finally found adequate expression. The palace's interior displayed innovations that reflected Nero's aesthetic vision and his architect's ingenuity. A rotating dining room whose ceilings scattered flowers and perfume upon guests below, walls encrusted with gold and precious stones, rooms whose decorations changed with the hours. These marvels demonstrated what imperial resources could create when guided by imagination, unconstrained by convention or cost. Nero reportedly declared upon the palace's completion that he could at last begin to live like a human being, a comment that revealed how inadequate he had found his previous accommodations. Critics saw in the Domus Aurea confirmation of every accusation leveled against its builder. The emperor had burned Rome to clear space for his pleasure palace, sacrificing the homes of hundreds of thousands to satisfy his megalomaniacal ambitions. The popular verse that circulated captured this sentiment with memorable brevity. Rome was becoming one house, and citizens should flee to Veii, unless that house consumed Veii too. The generosity Nero had shown in the fire's immediate aftermath faded from memory as the Golden House rose to dominate the city's center. The conspiracy that crystallized in AD 65 drew together senators, equestrians, military officers, and even members of the imperial household. Their shared conviction being that Nero's continued rule endangered everything they valued. Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator whose noble birth and cultivated manner made him an acceptable alternative to the reigning emperor, gave the plot his name and served as the figurehead around whom conspirators could rally. The plan called for Nero's assassination during games at the circus, the chaos of the crowded venue providing cover for the deed and its immediate aftermath. Betrayal exposed the conspiracy before it could be executed. A freedwoman's loose talk alerting authorities, who moved quickly to arrest those whose names she provided. Interrogation produced more names, the widening circle of suspects revealing how deeply dissatisfaction with Nero's rule had penetrated Roman elite society. The arrests multiplied as each confession implicated additional conspirators, the terror spreading through a senatorial class that suddenly discovered how many of its members had contemplated the emperor's removal. Seneca's name appeared among the accused, his involvement unclear, but his fate sealed by the mere suspicion that he had known of the plot and failed to report it. The philosopher who had guided Nero's youth, whose counsel had shaped the moderate policies of the early reign, now received the command that Romans of his class understood as a death sentence. He was to take his own life, the privilege of suicide preferable to execution's public disgrace. The death that followed became one of antiquity's most famous, its details preserved by historians who recognized in Seneca's final hours a demonstration of the Stoic principles he had spent his life teaching. He opened his veins while continuing to dictate philosophical reflections to scribes who recorded his words, his composure maintained through the slow bleeding that his aged body made slower still. When blood loss proved insufficient, he requested poison that a friend had long kept ready for such an eventuality. When even this failed to bring the end he sought, he entered a hot bath whose steam finally released him from a body that had resisted death with unexpected tenacity. His wife Paulina attempted to die alongside him, her veins opened in solidarity with the husband she refused to survive. Nero's soldiers intervened to save her life, the emperor preferring to avoid the criticism that would follow if his actions produced martyrs beyond those already condemned. She survived with pale scars, marking the devotion she had been prevented from completing. Her remaining years spent honoring the memory of the philosopher, whose teachings had guided her as fully as they had guided his more famous student. The executions and suicides that followed the conspiracy's exposure eliminated much of what remained of the senatorial goodwill that Nero's early reign had cultivated. Men who had served the empire faithfully found themselves condemned on evidence that often consisted of little more than association with others already accused. The terror created an atmosphere in which no one felt safe, in which speaking freely risked denunciation, in which the trust that bound Roman society together dissolved in mutual suspicion. Poppeia's death later that same year added personal tragedy to political catastrophe. The empress was pregnant with another child when she died, the sources attributing her death to a kick Nero delivered during an argument. though illness or complications of pregnancy offer alternative explanations that some historians have preferred. Whatever the cause, Nero's grief appeared genuine. He had loved Poppaea as he had loved no other woman, and her loss left him bereft of the companion who had supported his artistic ambitions through years when such support had grown increasingly rare. The emperor who emerged from AD 65 bore little resemblance to the promising youth who had addressed the Senate 11 years earlier. Conspiracy had demonstrated that powerful Romans wished him dead. Persecution had revealed capacities for cruelty that even his mother's murder had not fully exposed. And personal loss had stripped away the emotional supports that had sustained him through earlier crises. The final years of his reign would unfold in an atmosphere of suspicion and isolation, the artist emperor retreating ever further into a private world that the demands of governance could not entirely reach. The provinces that Nero had largely ignored during his artistic pursuits began demanding attention that could no longer be delegated or deferred. Judea erupted in revolt during AD 66, the tensions between Roman authority and Jewish religious practice finally producing the explosion that generations of friction had made inevitable. What began as protests against Greek provocations in Caesarea rapidly escalated into open warfare that threatened to destabilize the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The Jewish revolt presented challenges that exceeded anything Rome's eastern garrisons could manage without reinforcement. Jerusalem's defenders fought with the conviction of believers protecting their sacred city, their resistance stiffened by religious fervor that transformed ordinary men into warriors willing to die rather than submit to pagan occupation. Roman forces suffered early defeats that encouraged the rebellion's spread, the initial setbacks demonstrating that this uprising would require sustained military commitment to suppress. Nero's response to the crisis revealed that he could still recognize talent and delegate authority effectively when circumstances demanded it. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian, received command of the forces assembled to crush the rebellion, his appointment reflecting both his proven military abilities and his lack of political connections that might have made him threatening to an emperor increasingly suspicious of capable subordinates. This unassuming general from an undistinguished family would prove more consequential for Rome's future than anyone in AD 66 could have imagined. Vespasian brought to Judea the methodical competence that had characterized his earlier career in Britain and Africa. Rather than rushing to engage the rebels in decisive battle, he systematically reduced the fortified towns that supported Jerusalem, isolating the capital while his forces gained experience against an enemy whose determination exceeded their military sophistication. The campaign would continue for years, its conclusion delayed by events in Rome that would transform Vespasian from loyal general into emperor himself. Nero's attention, however, had already turned toward Greece, the land whose culture he had admired since childhood and whose artistic festivals offered stages worthy of his talents. The emperor who had performed before Roman audiences despite the scandal such appearances created now, proposed something unprecedented. A tour of Greece during which he would compete in the great festivals that Greek tradition had sanctified for centuries. No Roman emperor had ever undertaken such a journey for such purposes, but Nero was not a conventional Roman emperor. The departure for Greece in late AD 66 represented the fulfillment of artistic ambitions that had shaped Nero's entire reign. He traveled with an entourage that included musicians, actors, and the claque of supporters, whose applause would reinforce whatever reception Greek audiences provided. The journey itself became a procession, celebrating the artistic vision that Nero believed distinguished him from every ruler who had preceded him. Each stop along the route an opportunity to demonstrate talents that Roman prejudice had prevented him from fully displaying at home. Greece welcomed the emperor with the enthusiasm that imperial visits always commanded, the genuine appreciation for artistic achievement that characterized Greek culture, creating audiences more sympathetic than those Nero had faced in Rome. The great festivals that had been celebrated since before Rome existed now opened their competitions to a contestant whose status guaranteed outcomes that no other competitor could challenge. Nero would participate in the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games, and the Isthmian Games, a sweep of victories that no previous champion had ever achieved. The competitions themselves reflected the awkwardness that imperial participation inevitably created. When Nero entered chariot races, he fell from his vehicle during one event, but was nonetheless declared the winner on grounds that he would have won had he completed the course. When he competed in singing and lyre playing, judges awarded him victories that his performances may or may not have merited, their decisions shaped by awareness that disappointing the emperor carried consequences that fair judgment could not justify risking. Nero accumulated more than 1,800 victory crowns during his Greek tour, each award providing the validation that he craved from audiences whose appreciation he valued above any political achievement his reign might have produced. He announced the liberation of Greece from Roman taxation, a gesture of gratitude that delighted his hosts, while alarming financial officials who understood how this generosity would strain imperial revenues. The emperor, who had burned through treasuries to rebuild Rome and construct the Domus Aurea, now sacrificed additional income for the pleasure of Greek applause. The months stretched into more than a year as Nero extended his stay beyond any reasonable duration, his absorption in artistic pursuits leaving Rome without effective leadership, during a period when problems multiplied faster than subordinates could address them. Messages from Italy reported difficulties that required imperial attention: financial strains, senatorial discontent, administrative failures that competent governance might have prevented. Nero received these reports with irritation at interruptions to his Greek idyll, his responses inadequate to the challenges they described. Helios, the freedman Nero had left to manage affairs in Rome, eventually travelled to Greece personally to impress upon his master the urgency of returning. The situation in the capital had deteriorated beyond what letters could convey, the stability that Nero's presence might restore slipping further away with each week of continued absence. The emperor reluctantly agreed to return, his departure from Greece marked by expressions of regret that seemed more genuine than any emotion he had displayed regarding Roman affairs. The financial pressures that had been building throughout Nero's reign reached critical intensity as his expenditures consistently exceeded revenues that his policies had simultaneously reduced. The Great Fire's reconstruction costs, the Domus Aurea's extravagance, the Greek tour's expenses, and the ongoing military commitment in Judea combined to create deficits that no ordinary measures could address. Nero resorted to currency debasement, reducing the precious metal content of Roman coins in ways that would have consequences extending long beyond his reign. Confiscations supplemented debasement as a revenue source, wealthy citizens finding themselves accused of crimes whose primary function was to transfer their property to imperial coffers. The terror that had followed the Pisonian conspiracy provided precedents and mechanisms for eliminating anyone whose wealth attracted imperial attention. The legal forms of accusation and trial, barely concealing what amounted to robbery, conducted under official auspices. This plundering of the aristocracy accumulated resentments that would eventually find expression in actions more dangerous than mere grumbling. The generals whose loyalty maintained Nero's power became objects of the same suspicion that had destroyed so many senators and equestrians. Corbulo, whose eastern campaigns had brought Rome its greatest military successes during Nero's reign, received the summons that experienced commanders understood as a death sentence. He fell upon his own sword rather than submit to whatever fate Nero had planned for him, his final word reportedly being worthy, an acknowledgement that his death was appropriate for a Roman of his station, even if the circumstances that required it were not. Other commanders received similar treatment, their competence and popularity making them threats to an emperor who trusted no one whose abilities might enable them to challenge his position. The military leadership that should have been cultivating loyalty and maintaining discipline instead found itself decimated by purges that prioritized the emperor's psychological security over the empire's defensive needs. The legions that watched their commanders destroyed learned lessons about imperial gratitude that would influence their behavior when alternatives to Nero's rule finally presented themselves. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised the standard of revolt in March of AD 68, his rebellion proclaiming not his own ambitions, but his support for Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, whose distinguished lineage and conservative reputation made him an acceptable alternative to the reigning emperor. The uprising began as a provincial protest against taxation and maladministration, its rapid escalation into civil war, reflecting the depth of dissatisfaction that Nero's rule had created throughout the western provinces. Nero's initial response to news of the revolt displayed the detachment from reality that had characterized his recent behavior. He seemed more offended by Vindex's criticism of his artistic abilities than alarmed by the military threat the rebellion represented, his priorities revealing how completely his self-image as an artist had displaced his identity as emperor. When he finally recognized the seriousness of the situation, his plans for response alternated between grandiose fantasy and paralytic indecision. The legions on the Rhine crushed Vindex's forces at Vesontio, their loyalty to Rome initially overriding whatever sympathy they might have felt for the rebellion's objectives. Vindex himself died in the battle's aftermath, whether by his own hand or another's remaining unclear. But the revolt had served its purpose. It had demonstrated that Nero could be challenged, that provinces could refuse obedience, that alternatives existed to continued acceptance of a rule that satisfied no one beyond the emperor himself. Galba declared himself the representative of the Senate and Roman people, rather than claiming imperial title for himself, the careful formulation acknowledging that his authority derived from opposition to Nero rather than from any legitimate succession. Legions in Spain rallied to his cause, their example encouraging others throughout the western provinces to recalculate where their interests lay. The momentum that had sustained Nero's rule for 14 years began shifting toward a challenger whose most significant qualification was simply not being Nero. Rome itself remained the prize that both sides needed to secure, its garrison and population determining whether rebellion would succeed or fail. Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect, whose loyalty had been Nero's most reliable support, found his own position crumbling as guardsmen calculated the odds and concluded that Nero's cause was lost. Nymphidius Sabinus, Tigellinus's fellow prefect, actively encouraged this defection, promising the guard donatives that Galba would supposedly provide in exchange for their allegiance. The Senate that had endured Nero's contempt for 14 years sensed opportunity in his weakness. Senators who had learned to suppress their opinions now discovered reserves of courage that terror had concealed, their willingness to act against the emperor growing as his ability to punish them diminished. The body that had confirmed Nero's accession prepared to declare him a public enemy, transforming the emperor into an outlaw whose killing would be legal rather than treasonable. Nero's final days in power unfolded in an atmosphere of abandonment that must have seemed impossible to the young man who had once commanded the world's greatest empire. Courtiers who had competed for his favor disappeared to cultivate relationships with his likely successors. Servants who had attended his needs vanished when his ability to reward or punish them evaporated. Even the guards who should have protected him melted away, leaving the emperor virtually alone in a palace whose grandeur mocked his sudden powerlessness. The isolation that descended upon Nero stripped away every support that imperial position had provided, revealing beneath the purple robes a man whose artistic talents could not compensate for the political abilities he had never possessed. The performer who had craved applause found himself without an audience. The emperor who had commanded legions found himself without soldiers. The son of Agrippina, heir to Augustus, master of the Roman world, found himself with nothing beyond the memories of greatness that circumstances had swept beyond recovery. Reports of the Praetorian Guard's defection and the Senate's impending declaration forced Nero to confront the reality that remaining in Rome meant certain death. Flight offered the only possibility of survival, though where he might flee and what reception he might receive remained uncertainties that desperation could not resolve. The emperor, who had traveled to Greece in triumph, now contemplated escape from his own capital as a fugitive whose life depended on reaching safety before his enemies caught up with him.